everyone. What we'll do is we'll do the presentation in two parts. So I'll start by focusing on a very large region other than China, and Rebecca will give us a good coverage on relevant topics in China. So just an overview. It's a big continent, Asia Pacific, so we're seeking to cover some of the major parts of Asia Pacific, but also, rather than do a traditional update, is really focus on very topical things around BEPS and what's happening in Asia Pacific. And Rebecca will give us some good detailed insights on what's happening in China. Okay, so probably a good start is to give you a sense of what's happening in the region at the multilateral instrument point of view. You can see there's a lot of countries, big economies in the region that have signed up, and obviously we're all anticipating globally what the impact of the MLI will be, but in Asia Pacific there's such diversity in domestic tax regimes, particularly source-based countries, developing countries having very rigid views on how they administer their systems. And what will be particularly interesting in the MLI context is what each country's approach will be on MLI. And we're certainly expecting probably more diversity in approach on MLIs in the Asia Pacific region perhaps than in other parts. Obviously the EU has the opportunity of having an EU standard approach, but in Asia Pacific we're expecting a lot of differences, a lot of reservations and notifications, and what that'll do is it's probably a big warning sign that if you have clients that have operations in the region, or you have a client that is a subsidiary of an Asia Pacific headquartered group, the warning's there. Certainly tread very carefully. I think the analysis of treaty outcomes in the region, either where you have a sub or a holding company, will be equal, if not more complex in the region than it might be in other parts of the world. So that's a key observation. I think the other thing too to say is that probably like in other parts of the world, more countries that are not signed up will sign up. Probably Malaysia and Thailand that are not signed up are probably expected to in due course. They're probably taking a more cautious approach just to see what happens within the OECD. So that's a bit of a snapshot. It's obviously not a total coverage of the region. The one other large economy in the region which I forgot to put on there was Taiwan, which has not signed yet. But I think Rebecca, they're probably taking a different position to China, but without being too political. So that's a bit of a snapshot on the multilateral instrument at a macro level. Another key part of obviously BEPS is country by country reporting and master files and local files, and I apologise there's a lot of detail on these slides, but what it does is it gives you a good snapshot of how accelerated the major economies are in this particular initiative, and particularly around uniformity on approach and style. And there's certainly a lot of excitement in the region around information sharing. I think certainly a lot of the developing countries are keen to get some good data on transfer pricing arrangements within the region and also outside of the region. You'll see there's some real consistency in approach. They've been mainly early adopters. I think Singapore and Malaysia have come 1 year later. The thresholds are pretty typical to what's happening globally, so around that 750 million euro threshold, so pretty similar. The actual reporting deadlines tend to be consistent, that 12 months after year end, but I think China, Rebecca, they want a quick, 5 months after year end, which is going to be interesting. And look, the format at this stage, there is consistency with the OECD format, but certain countries want more, and that the CBC report is a pretty comprehensive report that's not just tax focused, it's really focusing on what the value drivers are of the multinational group. So I think there's certainly, we're certainly, even in Australia, we're getting a lot of work in this area where, not necessarily where we have an Australian headquarter group, but we're also helping headquarter groups, particularly in Asia, with Australian subs, helping them out with their CBC reporting. So the tip there is, even if your client is not necessarily headquartered, there's always an opportunity for you to get in there and help them with their CBC reporting, particularly when they're looked after by one of our competitors. And we've had some success in getting into larger clients by giving them the actual attention, the care that they want. So that's a another tip for all of you here. So that's just one aspect of the CBC reporting regime. So getting into the more detail, where I think a lot of us will see a lot more opportunities to get involved with local files in our own countries and help out with master files. There's a bit of divergence in the approach. Clearly, we're now getting more and more into the transfer pricing space now, and hence real opportunities for us to amplify the importance of getting transfer pricing right. Again, probably a big theme here is automatic exchange of information. That's what's generating a lot of excitement, is that this information will be freely and readily shared amongst all the tax authorities. And that, to put it bluntly, is what is really shifting that. And you saw it from Thomas this morning about the tax director's reaction to BEPS. Well, this is the number one. This is the one that's getting them out of their chair and moving very quickly. Massive opportunity for us. Even at just doing the local file work can be really good work, around doing your corporate tax return, sticking your nose in it and getting involved with doing some good transfer pricing work. And then, going the next step and helping them in a regional, if not in a global context, with the master file. Look, the surprising area here on penalties is Australia often is one out, but Australia's been extremely aggressive in penalties with non-compliance with this regime. You can see the penalties there are exorbitant, and they're trying to send a strong message. The fear is, I think, more and more countries around Asia will probably start copying what Australia are doing, but there's some big messages there that don't muck around. So that's a bit of a snapshot around what I would regard as one of the catalyst areas of BEPS that's really getting our clients' attention, and I think big messages there. Even if you don't have a full transfer pricing capability, there are opportunities for you to get in there and do the work. Another big part of BEPS, which, to be fair, I think is an area that BEPS hasn't really tackled very well, has been e-commerce. That just the sheer growth in the global economy on the e-commerce platform, and what BEPS has struggled to do is to really tackle e-commerce business from an income tax point of view. There's a lot of debate around source rules, practical compliance and whatnot, and inevitably what's happened is the focus has been more around consumption tax rather than income tax, and Asia Pacific's no different. What I'll do is I'll go through some very live emerging examples of how certain countries in the Asia Pacific region have been quite aggressive in this space, similar to what you've already heard, in North America and in Europe as well. India is a good example where the approach they've taken there is outside of their GST VAT system, which is reasonably new. They've imposed a very targeted levy, which often, as I think Sandeep has explained from his own experience, does not give the counterparty an opportunity to get a foreign tax credit in their home jurisdiction. And so essentially it can be a sunk cost to the effective tax rate of doing business as a foreigner coming in. But ironically, what it's doing is when this 6% levy is imposed, essentially what's happening is a lot of the foreign corporates are now just grossing up their contract prices. So the Indian business is the one that's actually ended up paying for what is otherwise perceived to be leakage from the Indian tax revenue. So they're grabbing the tax, but ultimately it's the Indian business community and consumers that are bearing the tax. So an interesting approach, and also the other interesting approach with the Indian approach is that it is a business-to-business tax. A lot of the e-commerce strategies that I'll go through have been more limited more to the business-to-consumer approach. Korea has been a bit more targeted in terms of the type of electronic services, and again also targeting consumers more than business, applying their standard VAT rate. Just checking time, so we're all good. Japan, they've got a pretty robust consumption tax regime, and they've extended that to business services. But in a more limited way. It's a bit more complex around how they construe foreign business supplies into Japan. Australia more recently has extended its GST to, interestingly, to pretty much any service, not necessarily just limited to digital services, but limited to business to consumer situations, but the compliance on businesses, foreign businesses, and proving that their client base are registered for GST is not straightforward. And New Zealand is following the same lead, using their base GST rate of 15% to probably on a more narrow basis focus on remote services. And Singapore, interestingly, is looking at expanding their GST system on two fronts, on business to business and business to consumer. And interestingly, on the business to business approach, using the reverse charge mechanism that will be familiar to a lot of you for your clients that are entering foreign jurisdictions for the first time. So the theme here is that Asian economies, Asian revenue authorities don't hesitate to use their consumption taxes. They're all getting smarter on how to capture, there's still going to be leakage, but how they'll capture the major players, the Amazons and whatnot that are selling products and services into their respective countries. So that's a bit of a snapshot on what I think is an emerging area of BEPS. Whether these regimes will change if the OECD and BEPS takes a different approach on income tax, I think is a question that I don't think anyone can answer here, but it's certainly one to keep an eye on. Another emerging trend on BEPS, again you've heard it earlier during the day, is around again trying to fight that over debt loading into funding acquisitions in your foreign jurisdiction. And the obvious platform there is an effective way of managing tax rates is maximising debt funding in these jurisdictions. So look, I think the trend here, which I'll go through, is the common theme is that the BEPS standard, which is that, and I'm oversimplifying it, that debt not in excess of 30% of EBITDA is being adopted. But interestingly, other regimes have had pretty robust thin cap rules anyway, and they haven't, like Australia, and they haven't necessarily seen the need to update their interest limitation rules. So India is following broadly the OECD approach with the ability to carry forward excess interest deductions for up to 8 years. New Zealand's thinking about it. The government's consulted and will act from 2018. Again, not necessarily fully on the same path as the OECD approach, but taking an interesting, almost transfer pricing capping approach, saying, in most circumstances we'll only permit an interest rate at a particular level. Malaysia is a bit more flexible in terms of the ratio of the debt to EBIT, to earnings in this case. So again, it's a bit fluid, but they're looking at bringing that in a little bit later from 1 January 2019. Whereas Korea is more looking at the OECD approach, again from 1 January 2019. Probably the more complex areas of BEPS, what we're seeing, it's a little bit slower in the take-up in Asia Pacific. Unfortunately, my country tends to lead the way on BEPS initiatives, or if not a global leader. Denise, I reckon we're the global leader, aren't we, when it comes to BEPS? So a good example of that, as you heard from Thomas earlier, is Australia's grabbed the UK diverted profits tax and put steroids on it. And also this multi-national anti-avoidance rule. The interesting part of these rules is, as Thomas explained, is they are domestic anti-avoidance rules that apply regardless of double tax agreements, regardless of the impact of multilateral instruments on our treaties. And they're very controversial in Australia. Very controversial, would you agree, Denise, in terms of the design? But interestingly, what it's doing is it's probably achieving its objective in that particularly larger corporates are reacting by changing their arrangements. The classic one is with the MAL. The example that Thomas gave, which is the most common, is a sales and marketing type structure where a foreign multinational would set up an Australian subsidiary with a limited risk sales and marketing function and pretty much just trap their profit in Australia at 30% tax based on quite a limited value attribution, and yet the sales would be consummated directly from a third party, a third country jurisdiction directly to the Australian consumer. And what that's done is it's actually resulted in the Amazons and whatnot increasing their margins, for sales and marketing support in Australia. So in a voluntary sense, multinationals are now starting to record more margins on those sales and marketing support services. Look, hybrid mismatches, early days in the region. Australia, just last week, the government released a discussion paper, which I still haven't read yet, but look, we expect it will follow the BEPS themes. New Zealand and Korea are two other jurisdictions. I think my expectation is the other major economies within Asia will pick up those issues. What will be interesting is when those countries have actually relied on hybrid mismatches to drive some activity, what compromises they might have to make in terms of the positions they take, what aspects of BEPS Action 2 will they adopt and which ones they won't adopt. So that's another snapshot of other BEPS developments in the region. The more nuanced ones are a bit slower on the uptake in the Asia-Pacific region. So I think that's it, yeah. So look, what we'll do is I'll pass on to Rebecca and hopefully we'll have enough time where we can take some questions. So thank you.
Hello, good afternoon, and thank you for reserving 10 minutes for China part. I will give you a brief introduction. I'm Rebecca from back there, China. In the 10 minutes, we will share with you some key tax policy developments in China and also discuss the trends and our observations from a forward-looking perspective. In today's sharing, we'll share three things that happen in China. The first is VAT reform in China. The second is the new transfer pricing compliance requirements released by SAT, the state administration of taxation in China. And the second thing is China country strategy called One Belt and One Road initiatives. That I will share you some introduction of the initiative and when that the initiative will impact the Chinese enterprise and how we can benefit from the initiative. That's the three things I'm going to share today. Okay, so first we will move to the China VAT reform. I think that the China VAT reform seems to be the most important taxation reform in the past 20 years. You know that maybe you are aware that in China, in the old days, we have two kinds of turnover tax. One is a value-added tax, and then the other is a business tax. And so they are. The difference for the VAT and the BT is that the VAT can be credited against and the business tax cannot. The VAT and the BT has been levied on sales of goods and services respectively in China for decades. The fact is that as the business tax cannot be credited against, so the double taxation has given rise. So to solve this kind of problem and also to promote the economic upgrade, so that China launched the VAT reform in 2012. At the Shanghai was selected to be the pilot zone at the first step. And then after 4 years of industry-by-industry pilot implementation and regional runs, now the VAT reform has been rolled out nationwide and overall sectors has been covered by the 2016. So here's the overall. You can say that the overall is we have two kinds of turnover tax. One is value-added tax, and the other is a business tax. That's the most difference of these two kinds of taxes. One is can be credited and the business tax cannot. Okay, so after the VAT reform, now the business tax has disappeared from China taxation system and was replaced by the value-added tax. So for general VAT taxpayers that include VAT incurred may be credited against output VAT in computing the VAT payable. And as of today, the applicable VAT rates, you can say that we have three tax VAT rates in China currently, as 17 and 11, and also 6. Most of kinds of services can, the tax rates, value-added tax rates for most kinds of services is 6. So what's the VAT reform impact for your clients or maybe client's business in China? Here's an example. You can say that from the slides that it's a normally used arrangement for foreign investors who has investment in China. And the company A is a manufacturing company located in Shanghai, and the U.S. company is the parent company, and the U.S. company just provided technology licensing service to the company A. So after the VAT reform, the rate is subject to 10% withholding tax and a 6% VAT. And what's happened before and after the VAT reform, you can say from this table that from the net payment perspective, the U.S. company still can get the same amount net payment. As you can say, it's only small, minor difference from the net payment perspective. But what's the difference is that before the reform, that the U.S. company they paid 5 yuan business tax, and the 5 yuan cannot be credited by the Chinese company. But after the reform, that the U.S. company paid nearly 5.66 value-added tax, and this value-added tax can be utilized by the Chinese enterprise. That's the difference between the before the reform and after the reform. What we can do for our clients and what we can recommend for our clients' business in China, here are some suggestions. Firstly, I think, as just mentioned, that we have 3 VAT tax rates in China currently. So if a transaction is a combination of service and goods, it is advisable to recommend our clients to split the transaction into a goods and service transaction. Then you can just reduce the VAT tax rate. Also, as the policy is very new policy, so there's still some gray area, and this gray area maybe can used as a planning opportunity. And others need to point out is the tax planning ideas are often not associated for one transaction. Hence, the whole transaction chain needs to be analyzed and considered. And the last but not the least is as mentioned, the tax the VAT you paid in after the VAT reform can be utilized by the customer or clients in China. So just to go back and negotiation with your clients and to renegotiation the pricing and who will bear the tax. Maybe it can just get your money back because someone is benefiting from the tax that you paid to the China authority. That's what we're going to share from the about VAT reform. The second thing, as Theo has mentioned, that China also has a very stricter rule for the transfer pricing things. So in 2016, that the China SAT also released a new transfer pricing compliance requirement to the foreign enterprise in China. So compared with the older TPD requirements, the local file requires more information to disclose more information under the transfer pricing analysis. Under the old transfer pricing rule that you just need to, a Chinese enterprise, you just need to tell the tax authority what's the profit margin of your company and also what's the profit margin of the comparable companies. If your profit margin is not lower than the comparable company's profit margin, maybe that's this TP documentation can be accepted by the Chinese tax authority. But under the new requirement that the Chinese authority tax authority may need a very detailed value channels. They don't just see the Chinese enterprise profit margin. They would like to know the whole big picture of the and whole transfer pricing policy or strategy of the whole group. So they need to, they ask the detailed value chain analysis in current documentation requirements. So others, besides, also they need to more disclosures of intergroup equity transfer, including the terms of payment, the target's geographic location and timing. Something is in the screen that you can say. Another important change is that under the older requirement, you may not need to disclose much more things about the service charges from intergroup. So under the new requirement that the intergroup service charges need to be disclosed clearly, and just as Thomas from this morning, just as he mentioned that if the Chinese tax authorities thought that the Chinese enterprise hasn't get benefit from the service charge, this kind of service charge cannot be deducted before China enterprise income tax when the Chinese company they cannot be deducted before the EIT. That's the two things. The second thing is it's a very important country strategy of China, also a political policy, I think. You may all aware that more than 2,000 years ago, as China's a man is Zhang Qian, called Zhang Qian, he helped to establish the Silk Road. It's a network to trade China's silk to Central Asia and the Arab world. The name came from, so we call it the Silk Road. The road came from one of the Chinese most important exports, that's silk. So our president, Mr. Xi Jinping, we think he's a very ambitious man. So several years ago, that's Mr. Xi Jinping, he just proposed to establishing a modern equivalent, creating a network of railways, roads, pipelines, and other things that would link China and Central Asia, West Asia, and parts of South Asia. So the government has also authorized Belt and Road Plan in 2 years ago, and with two main things. One is the Silk Road Economic Belt, and the last is the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road. You can see here, and the red line is the Silk Road Economic Belt, and the blue line is the 21st Century Maritime Silk Road. The China government now is encouraging enterprise to do some investment along with these two lines. It's from China to Central Africa, to some Africa, to Central Asia and European countries, you can say from this. So in our latest analysis on the Belt and Road Initiative, that we look at how the Belt and Road Initiative is reshaping the future economic cooperation between China and the BNR countries. Major future prospects from economic collaboration between China and their BNR countries are shown as below. The first is that we thought that China would sign free trade agreements may be the most effective way for China to expand its business with BNR countries. The second is China will opening up stock and bond markets for BNR countries and provide more investment opportunities for Chinese business. And the second is that they were promoting the RMB internationalization in major BNR economics rather than in the developed countries is more likely to be successful. And the second, the last thing is the domestic policy, the preferential policy support will be critical in encouraging Chinese companies to invest more in the BNR countries. As in today's China, if the Chinese enterprise, they're just going to invest abroad, they can benefit from the government incentives, some tax refund, and the low rate funding support from state-owned banks. So what had happened in China. So as a feedback of what's the influence is that in the past 2016, that's the first time that China's outbound direct investment has overtaken the inbound direct investment. The total amount that China enterprise outbound investment in the 2016 hits the $200 billion. So I have another slide, but it's not here. So I think that it's as the I don't know where the slides go on. So I just want to say that I think the BNR initiative is country strategy for China, and I think more and more Chinese enterprise they just go abroad. So I think our international tax experts or other international professionals will benefit from them, from the initiative. So I think what we can do for that Chinese enterprise, firstly, maybe if you have some targets or investment opportunities in your country, and maybe we can recommend to our clients. And when they decided to invest in your country, maybe they need to know the right strategy to entering in your country, the holding structure, the tax environment, the tax cost, and how to do business in your company, in your country. I think maybe we can provide one-stop solutions for our clients. And the second, maybe, and the third thing is that maybe they also need to find some partnership in your country. If you have some recommendations, just let them know. So it's what we're going to share today. So these three things. So hoping that in the future we can make more service opportunities and to work with each other and to achieve our goal in the future. Thank you.
Any questions of Rebecca or myself? I think just on the last point, in Australia, there's a lot of excitement on the Belt and Road initiatives, more in the indirect way, particularly if you've got clients in the building, construction, technical services area. There's just massive opportunities to indirectly work on as subcontractors on a lot of these massive projects. So I think that's probably at least my insight, particularly amongst our client base, rather than actually being, the owner of the or co-owner of these massive projects. I think there's huge opportunities for our typical clients in that area. Anyway, all right.